guys, good morning. This is Dr. Sadasivam. There are many stalwarts in this group who are much more knowledgeable than me. But I will try to answer some of these questions raised one by one. First is about the participatory notes. In fact, the participatory notes are offshore derivative instruments. Of course, we cannot claim that they are completely transparent. There is some amount of opacity and intransparency in that, but there is also a transparency involved in it because the FIIs, that is the foreign institutional investors, report each transaction to SEBI on a daily basis. Of course, the only point of anonymity is the person who is depositing that money, and that is why P notes often are instruments through which money laundering, kickbacks, anything that involves illegal transactions, they are all carried out because the identity of the person is not disclosed in the whole transaction and it is anonymous. Something like your cryptocurrencies, right? But when you do this analysis for the last year, it is not even 50,000 crores funds from Mauritius which you were talking about, right? So max, if you include the other instruments, it will come out to say 75,000. So if you look at the overall 3 trillion economy, this 50,000 crore is peanuts. It's not much. It's something that reminds me of nursery rhyme, Johnny, Johnny, yes, Papa, eating sugar, no, Papa, where you give 100 rupees to your son to the shop who brings sugar. On the way he munches little bit of sugar from that, but all said and done it brings little bit of foreign exchange, and when we are talking about a $3 trillion economy, that's not a major concern, I guess. And the second point that is raised is about some of the fiscal measures announced by the United States, 1 trillion as you pointed out. In fact, if you look at this investment right from the last year, more than $2.5 trillion have been pumped in for various activities, stimulus activities. In fact, 2 days back, there was an announcement of another $500 billion to be spent on stimulus. So this much amount of money into the system, we know we are all in a globalized world and we are not completely insulated. So any money that is pumped into the system that crosses borders and they have ramifications throughout the world. So in fact, the rising commodity prices, whether it is steel, plastic, cement, your rare metals, etc., all that is because of commodity prices and large part of consumption driven in China at this point in time, post-COVID world. So all said and done, with such things happen through the world, inflation is a natural outcome of all that. Too much of money chasing too few goods, and when the input prices are on the increase because of increase in commodity prices, we are not completely insulated, but these fiscal stimulus do have an effect on inflation, right? We need to do some kind of an econometric analysis in order to find out what effect of stimulus would lead to what amount of increase in inflation, etc., etc. So we have seen how there is a super cycle which is happening in steel, as a result of which most of the steel companies in India, starting from your Tata Steel, Jindal Steel, your JSW, all these have doubled, tripled in the last 3 or 4 months. In fact, I've put up another video on the subject. So this fiscal stimulus is one part of that, and thanks for raising that point. And it's not just the physical stimulus. If you look at the fiscal deficit in US alone, it's more than 2.75 trillion. There was a news item recently that just in the first 8 months, US had a fiscal deficit of $2.1 trillion. Right? That's equal to the GDP of 80% of the economies in the world. In fact, India's GDP is somewhere around 2.8 or $3 trillion, and your fiscal deficit in US is by the end of this year, their fiscal deficit will be equal to the whole GDP of our country, and that's the way things are panning out in this post-COVID world. So now if you look at this kind of a monetization, there is no doubt that it will lead to a huge amount of inflation. There's no doubt in it. We need to be ready for that. So money printing is something that is being talked very much about, your fiscal stimulus. In fact, that is also a kind of money printing. It's a kind of monetization, though it's non-conventional for the governments to raise funds, because fundraising is required because we are going through a crucial time. We need money for subsidies, free vaccination, lift people out of poverty, etc. All that requires huge amount of money, and therefore, apart from borrowings and disinvestments, etc., etc., sometimes the governments resort to money printing. Money printing doesn't mean printing money notes. It's not that. It is a source of raising funds. It generally happens when the central bank, that is Reserve Bank in our country, borrows directly from the, buys bonds from the government of India. Not necessarily bank notes that we talked about, without a corresponding increase in the nominal GDP. Please understand the difference between nominal GDP and the real GDP, because a lot of people who confuse nominal GDP with the real GDP. We will talk about that little later when we come to that subject. Because there is enormous amount of relief that is required, the government resorts to all these actions. In fact, a new brand of monetary theory has started, which is called as MMT, Modified Modern Theory. I saw it in some, I think, Economist or Harvard Business Review, or I don't exactly remember. It is MMT, Modified Monetary Theory. Those of you who have studied econometrics in your universities, you are aware of how there was a gold standard at one point of time. Before that, we had barter system. Then came currency, then gold standard. Then it shifted to Keynesian economics. And then that is the economics during the early part of the last century, 1920, 1925. Then over a period of time, it was the Indian context. We had Mahalanobis, developmental economist, and then we had Milton Friedman and host of those economists. So whatever economists, if you see who is the best, everybody is right, because every economist had their own ways and means of running the government, especially running the monetary and fiscal policies of the government. It's very much similar to the father of the house putting money in large stock caps like your Reliance, HDFC Bank, etc. And the son wants to put money in cryptocurrency because he's willing to take more risks. He's educated, he understands computer science, he knows what is coding. So his point is cryptocurrency is giving huge returns, and he's compelling his dad to put money in cryptocurrency. In the same house, you have a patriarch of the house, the grandfather of the house. He says share market is not correct, we need to put money in postal savings, or because he believes the State Bank of India savings banks, right? Even if it is 3.5%, he believes in the post office more than he believes in Reliance, right? That's the grandfather patriarch of the house. We all have, we also have one gentleman. Anyway, because he talks about one of his uncles who lost money in some Indian hotels some 25 years back, and he still carries the same story in his hand, and that uncle lost his wealth, etc. He's not aware of the fact that people have tripled their money in the last 6 months by putting their money in companies like Tata Motors or Majesco or etc. etc. And the fathers. So these kind of disagreements keep happening between your patriarch of the house, your uncle, father, and your son who is interested in crypto. So this way, economists also differ, whether it's Friedman or your Subburao or your C. Rangarajan or your John Maynard Keynes, or each of these people have their own ways of means of running the government. So we won't be able to decide which one is good or not. Now, in this situation, we were talking about the fiscal stimulus and how this fiscal stimulus is leading to huge money into the system. Obviously, when there is huge amount of money in the system, there will be inflation. We have seen cases like your Venezuela or in Zimbabwe at one point of time. They did the same thing, and there was a runaway inflation. Runaway inflation happened in Germany also. We need to be happy, where people had to pay 5 lakh rupees for a loaf of bread, right? So we need to look at till what point of time we will adopt these measures. In fact, in the last video, we talked a lot about accommodative stances. We started with hawkish stance, your dovish stance, neutral stance, and accommodative stance. Today we are in an accommodative stance as announced by the Reserve Bank of India. So we will continue. It doesn't mean we will continue in the stance for 15 years. Sometimes we have fever, there is a medication for 5 days or 7 days, or a course for 10 days. It doesn't mean you will follow that for 10 years. Till such time you have the fever, we will, for a temporary period, we will adopt to that lifestyle, and once we recover, then lifestyle has to change. Same thing happens in the economy also. Yes, inflation is bound to be there. So when the whole country is burning, for example, we are in a very crucial situation today. COVID affecting the livelihoods of people. Last year it was complete lockdown. This year, even if such a lockdown is not there, the effect is felt across in the rural areas much more. At least last year we had agriculture to rescue us, but this time agriculture is also affected because it affected the rural household a lot more than it affected the urban population. I'm talking about this year. But yes, good signs, good sign of southwest monsoon, and that's going to give us bumper harvest. So positives are there. Life is all about positives, and government, and as a government, we need to resort to the right economic policy as and when required, and we will not continue with the same strategy for a very long time. So coming back to this fiscal stimulus which you raised, and what kind of an effect it can have on the inflation, we talk of fire in a building analogy. When there is fire in the building, you don't look for clean water. Even if you find ditch water, drainage water, you will pour, because first job is to contain the fire. After that, let's, everything gets cleaned up, whether it is a drainage water or what. So at this point in time, what is important for the country, we need to do that, and we need to leave it to the wisdom of people in the government to do that. So now, as far as the inflation is concerned, you raised a point. Will this inflation, after taking that, then the growth will become Hindu rate of growth, 10% growth, 4%, then it will be 5. That's not a correct logic, because when we are talking about GDP growth, we are talking about real GDP growth and not the nominal GDP growth. Because when you talk about the nominal GDP, it is the market value of all goods and services produced in this country, and it's already adjusted for inflation. But normally when the government comes out with this kind of growth figures, they're all real GDP figures, and they're all adjusted for inflation. So there is a very important parameter which is called as GDP deflator, because this GDP deflator, what it does is it measures changes in the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and that is another way of measuring your real GDP. You use that in a formula which is I'm not taking an econometric class, but just to give you a small explanation. Nominal GDP, you divide it by the GDP deflator, which is always mentioned in terms of hundreds. You divide it by 125 or 120, depending on whatever calculations released by the Indian Statistical Institute at Calcutta. You arrive at a real GDP. So your Hindu rate of growth logic does not hold here, because what we are talking about is the real GDP growth, which is already adjusted, so don't worry about it. So that's what it. And one more important point I think raised was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India being whatever you raised this question. But how does that matter, my friend? My question is, it shouldn't be an issue at all. I would give you a Maruti Udyog Limited analogy, and you don't need the managing director of the company to have a knowledge of assembling and disassembling the counter shaft of SS80F. Okay, in your own words, that knowledge is not required. He has been in the government service for a very long time, and he understands the ropes, nuances. He understands all the finesse in to run a monetary and fiscal policy quite well. That's as far as your this point MA history jive is concerned. And about the IAS officers and the BJP government, that's a little bit of politics, and we've been doing that all the while through our discussions in the normal WhatsApp, and we will continue to do so, right? One point we have not talked about is the K-shaped recovery that you brought into that discussion. K-shaped recovery is a very pertinent point you have brought in, because the GDP, yes, GDP estimates are being revised southwards. They are contracting. A lot of stimulus is being given. Industries are not picking up, etc. And on the other hand, the markets are going up. In fact, as I am speaking you today, Yesterday, of course, there was a slight dip, but market is touching 16,000 last year, same time. In the month of March 2020, if you remember, when the COVID struck us, the Nifty was somewhere around 8,000, 7,500, I guess. I don't have the figures right now with me. But now it's jumped two times, guys, more than two times. Where is 7,500 and where is 16,000? More than double in just 1 year. Right. We need to remember one thing, that the street is discounting the short-term effects of COVID. So whatever you are seeing in this, your Moody's forecast, your S&P's forecasts, IMF, contracting economy, all that, they are uh, very short-term in nature. So the market is ignoring the short-term, discounting those short-term effects of COVID for long-term gains in the Indian economy. Look at the Indian economy, right? It's very, very good because of many steps the government has taken. Government has taken reforms, investment in infrastructure, host of other things. So in my mind, some points come to my mind, which is also being reinforced by many economists through many articles in Economic Times, Business Standard, Harvard Business Radio, your economist, etc. First is vaccination. We are going on full-fledged vaccination. In fact, I think it was Anurabha Rai Saab had put up a post which says that India is vaccinating one Germany every day. Beautiful analogy. That's the rate at which the vaccination is happening in our country, and COVID will be passed behind us. And that's what the market is concerned about. Market is concerned about long-term aspects, not short-term in terms of what will happen tomorrow, next week. Secondly, if you look at the corporate profits, the market estimates, the street estimates that the corporate profits during this year will be to the tune of 2,09,795 crore. I don't know how, but it had come out in a national vernacular, right? Somewhere more than 2 lakh crores is going to be the profit, corporate profits during this year, and that's clearly reflected because your market prices are slave of corporate earnings. Right. Another reason is the work that RBI is doing. Absolutely no doubt about it. RBI is doing everything possible. We are talking about both the monetary as well as the fiscal policies. Excellent work done by RBI and government. Look at PLI schemes, production linked, your ECLGS, your TLTROs, your fiscal stimulus, open market operations, your accommodative stance, the investment in the infrastructure. I put up some videos on this, etc. They've done a great job, you know. So if you remember when the COVID struck last year, if you look at some of the measures that the government had put in, they're all mind-boggling schemes. They're doing a great job. Okay. So now the next one, as on date, very few investable options today. If you look at interest rates, they're very, very low. Where does your money go? Equity is one area where people see some reasonable returns. Now pensioners have started putting money in equity markets and options. Everybody talks about, old uncles are speaking to me, right? Dr. Sada, why don't you teach us options? Why don't you teach us futures? What is equity, short strangle, long strangle, iron butterfly, iron corridor, and hedging strategies? Uncles are asking me these days. Investable options have come down. Real estate does not give you returns. Gold prices are low. Your real estate prices are low. In fact, real estates have given negative returns in the last 3 or 4 years. Right, I'm planning to sell my Sun City flat anyway. So very few investable options, and that's where equity markets play a very important role. And when too much of money come into the stock markets, obviously the market has only one way, which is to go up. So now to answer your K-shaped query, this answers to some extent. Look at foreign portfolio investments. There is a huge inflow of money from foreign countries, FPIs. In foreign countries, interest rates are very low. But except for short while, 2 months back, the bond rates in US went up. That was when we had a big crash, because most of that money started going towards US, because US bonds were giving treasury bonds 10 years, 15 years. The yield curve started going up. Temporary, but once again it started coming inside, which you can see in the Indian stock market going up to 16,000 Nifty, right? So most of you, if you have listened to my RBI governor's address 3 4 days back, I talked about FPI coming, money coming inside. That was completely in Hindi with my half knowledge of Hindi. I put up that Hindi video, right? So now the next is the manufacturing boom that is happening today. That's because of PLI and suppliers, because of this COVID virus. China is not doing very well, and people looking at India as the next destination. Your Taiwan and Bangladesh, Hong Kong, etc. Coupled with India, your excellent schemes, your PLIs, your fiscal stimulus, banking reforms, your Surface Acts, your IBCs, all that is putting India in the map of the world, and India will become a manufacturing center of the world, competing with China. Since you've talked about this K-shaped recovery process, where GDP figures are going down, but market rates are going up. So once again to summarize, one is your vaccination, huge interest in corporate. Third is portfolio investors. Fourth is the fiscal stimulus packages. And then we have talked about India's new position in the world, and we've talked about US bond markets. We've talked about manufacturing boom in India, your ECGL as your corporate profits, your PLI schemes, the corporate profits are going to be huge, your monetary stimulus, your fiscal stimulus, all that the government is doing. So that makes investment in India a long-term good option, right? Interest rates are low, and you have a stale government, and people don't see great returns in gold, real estate, etc. So that is driving too much money into the stock market, as a result of which stock prices are going up and GDP going down. Your K, right, Anurag? So RBI in fact said there will be a bubble. That was one week back. And surprisingly, the day RBI released this statistics saying that there will be a bubble. In fact, the jump started from that day in the stock market. What? In fact, I was also wanting to go short on some of these stocks, hoping that market will go down because of the RBI report. Market doesn't care about what the RBI says. RBI is good at making all these fiscal and monetary policies, but not in terms of how the market will pan out, because market largely depends on the sentiments of the people. So in short, the government is doing a great job. We've talked a lot about the some of the initiatives that the government has done, right? So this is from the limited domain of my own knowledge. There are many stalwarts in this group. We have Mayank Parikh ji, we have people who have held CEO level positions, Suresh Sethuratnam, etc. A lot of such people said. Raj Karbanda, a lot of senior people are in this. UC Sharma ji, who have all held senior level positions. I think I'm nowhere in front of them. So I really wish to hear some of their own expert comments as far as the Indian economy is concerned. And I think, Anurag, as promised, I have answered each and every question of yours except one question, which was about your IAS and the BJP ruled states, etc. Yes, we will resume those discussions through our normal WhatsApp chat. Okay guys, thank you very much. Have a great day. This is a long video, but this is for Anurag, and thank you very much. Jai Hind.